I've missed a piece of paper. There we are. So let's talk about impacting. So Boris asked me to do this session on impacting. I think that that term is not a useful one. The idea of impacting, all right, is something you do sort of after you've done your argument. You then impact your argument. I think that every part of your argument should be constructed in such a way as to be impactful, and I think that's important. This is not an addendum to your skills. This is how you construct and choose all of your arguments. To that end, the most important time to think about impact is in the brainstorming part of your prep time. You should be thinking then about what matters to the debate. What is going to be important to the debate? What are going to be the contested issues? Because choosing the arguments that have the most capacity for impact in the debate is going to be the easiest ways that you get arguments that are going to be impactful in that debate. So, what does it mean to be impactful with your arguments in a debate? And I think there are two aspects of this, and they're kind of interrelated, and I'm going to go through both of them throughout this session. First is probably what you first thought of when you heard that this was the title of this session, which is impact from the argument. So the impact you have on the stakeholders, how can you make that stakeholder important? How can you make that stakeholder seem significant? How do you make that stakeholder one that has a large amount of harm that hits upon it or that influences a large number of people, or why your principle is important, why it's something that's significant. But I think the second part of this, and equally important, especially in British parliamentary style, is having impact on the debate with your arguments. You want arguments that dominate the speaking time of the debate, arguments that cannot easily be brushed aside in someone's introduction or with 30 seconds of rebuttal. Some of those skills will overlap, and I'll get into both of them as we go on. So, to begin with, I want to talk about a very beginner surface level. How do we start to make impactful arguments? The very first aspect of this is basic topic analysis. You should always be thinking, and I see this gotten wrong quite often, so people who, shake their heads and think, oh, this isn't about them, I can see you right there. It is in fact about all of you, because all of you get this wrong occasionally. What is the most relevant context of the debate? What is the most reasonable interpretation of the topic? Ask yourselves those questions, because ultimately the way to have the most impact in the debate and the way to have arguments that are most impactful is to have arguments on the grounds that your adjudicator expected the debate to go on, and on the most contested grounds of the debate, because they will be the most important and the most discussed grounds. If you were an opening team, dominating the contested ground of the debate early is the easiest way that you can have significance into your closing half. The second thing I want to say about topics is that when you are giving your arguments, you want your arguments to have direct and constant connection to the topic. Not something you do at just one line at the start and one line at the end of your analysis. It is something that should be referred to throughout all of your arguments. And for all of you here, I want you to try an exercise over the next few debates you do, which is never use the phrase, "this policy." I want you to erase that phrase from your vocabulary, and instead of it, always use a phrase that actually describes what is being done by that policy, that actually describes the physical processes of that policy, that actually describes what that policy or what that idea or what that thing we are regretting does in real terms. Because doing that forces you to concentrate on what is going to be something that is actually deeply connected to the topic. I'm going to give you a practical example of a debate that occurred recently here at Monash. Does everybody remember the Jamal should choose a life of organized crime over legitimate employment topic, right? So the opening government, who shall remain nameless, Deepak, ran a lot of principled arguments saying why it's legitimate for Jamal to seek revenge against the government, why it's legitimate for Jamal to be angry at society. Those are not as closely connected to the topic as you need in order for this sort of argument to fly. Instead, what you need to be saying is things like, racism casts you out of society. It says you don't belong. It says you have no place. It says that society has deemed its values and has decided that you are valueless to that society, which is why a gang something that gives you belonging, something that gives you purpose and value, is the way that you can find redress for what has been done to you by that racism and by society. That is already a much closer connection to that topic and means that I don't get to win that debate from OO with every single POI I ask being, sure, but why are you selling cocaine? Right? That was all I had to do because the arguments weren't as closely connected to the topic as they needed to be in order to carry through and be impactful down the debate. Always have that direct, constant connection to the topic. And in principle debates, that's extremely important, and I'll go on with this video later to show you some practical examples of that. The second thing after topic analysis that I want to talk about in regards to beginners is concentrating your forces when it comes to arguments. My most common piece of feedback that I give to beginner debaters is you really did have all of the things you needed in your speech to prove this. It's just that they were in such disparate parts that I did not feel the impact of them. When you take different parts of an argument and have them spread throughout the speech, it is very unclear when it is that you have managed to prove a substantive point. When you've decided what you want to prove, i.e. you want to prove that development is important for a nation, right? Don't sprinkle little bits and pieces about why it's important throughout the speech. Get up and say, we think development provides 3 key benefits to a nation, and we think those benefits are important. Benefit 1, benefit 2, benefit 3. Having that concentrated is extraordinarily important for making sure that your adjudicator knows that you have proven something substantive in the debate, making sure that the rest of the debate can't ignore that, and making sure that your adjudicator feels that it is impactful and necessary that the debate deal with that. Third thing to talk about, and quite connected to that in terms of beginners. Have an interest and advocate for that interest. What is the important outcome, process, or stakeholder for you in the debate? What is the thing you are advocating for? Pick that and defend that, and then say why it happens. Importantly here, recognize the type of debate you are in and how you want to contest it. Think about the topic that we should never lock up non-violent criminals, right? This is the most cookie-cutter, well-known topic in the history of the world. But you can contest it in different ways. You can contest it in a principled ground or a practical ground. You can contest it as advocating for the wrong goal of the criminal justice system, or you can contest it as saying you agree on that goal, but you disagree that this is the most effective way to get there. So, for example, if you wanted to contest what the goal should be for that destination, what sort of debate are you in? If you're trying to contest the goal of a debate, principled one, yeah. What's it sometimes also called in sort of common Monash terminology? It's a destination debate. You disagree on what the destination of the criminal justice system ought to be. So, for example, the government side in that debate might make arguments that they feel that rehabilitation is the most important aspect of the criminal justice system, and they feel that prison time for non-violent offenders is harmful to the process of rehabilitation for them. But that rehabilitation is the key interest because that protects future people from being the victims of crimes, and because they think those criminals themselves are the victims of a society that has ostracized them, and therefore they should be taken care of. If you are on the negative, make a concentrated case that there is a different interest that the criminal justice system should be advocating for, and that that interest is one that is more important. In that case, punishment. We think the purpose of the criminal justice system is to find justice for those who are wronged. Even if that wrong was non-violent in its form, somebody has been the victim of a crime that was not their fault, and it is perfectly legitimate for them to say that a person ought to suffer similarly as recompense for them for that injustice. This is about making someone whole again. This is about making what's wrong right, and that's what you stand for in the debate. So that's how you can contest a journey debate. But recognize that that's what you're in, and have that as a concentrated attack on the destination of that debate. What if you were instead trying to contest the journey of that debate? So you agree that there is rehabilitation as the fundamental goal of the criminal justice system, but you are on opposition and you want to contest that this is a useful policy for that outcome. What do you say? I can see Deepak ready to raise his hand. Go.
Sure.
Like what?
Or in that, like, what's the debate?
The debate is that we would never lock up non-violent criminal offenders.
And you're prioritizing rehabilitation.
Yeah.
You're like, I don't know, but that's what you want to do.
That you can get rehabilitation in prison.
Yeah.
Probably more effectively than so they like have to stay there and do like the art therapy or whatever it is.
Yep.
It's art therapy in my
I would run a purely negative off case where I would just say that in the instances your policy or whatever you're arguing for will not reach rehabilitation, would rather harm them even further and like those kinds of things.
Are you going to be able to do that if your government is running sophisticated arguments about drug culture in prisons and about how it destroys opportunity going into the future, how it takes people away from their society and destroys their ability to trust in that society and the legitimate operations of its laws? Is straight negation going to win that debate for you?
No, I don't think
Probably not, right?
You've got to do three things. So the first thing is contest whether individuals are better rehabilitation, whether inside or outside, and also build up your case a bit. The second thing is looking at individuals who aren't hit by that model, so i.e. all the like violent offenders who may have committed one offense, but may still need rehabilitation and may not be getting it through their thing. And then lastly, look at long-term political change in terms of rehabilitation and who gets it better on which side.
Yeah, that political change one seems a bit woolly, but I think the first two are absolutely spot on, and what you'll notice there is that they are key interests that he has identified, key processes that he wants to advocate for, and so he can concentrate very clearly his arguments on those. We think, number one, rehabilitation occurs better in prison than on the outside. Why? One, we can provide services and force those services on people in prison. This looks like compulsory therapy. This looks like constant monitoring of them so that we know who they associate with. This looks like X, Y, Z thing so that you can demonstrate that. But it's something that has to happen in a concentrated form, and it has to happen with you identifying what is the outcome of that prison process that you want to advocate for. Because if you want to say, we think that rehabilitation occurs better in prison and we're going to provide for really nice services in prison, everyone's going to have like a courtyard and a fountain and a tree and a PlayStation, it's all going to be nice, but also we believe in punishment as the primary operation of the criminal justice system. We want these people to suffer. You're probably not going to get very far in that debate because, you know, you've made things that don't quite work out. So, in those instances, have that interest and advocate for it and do so in a way that is concentrated in its form. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of beginners and their skills, manner. Your manner is extraordinarily important in terms of your ability to get increasingly complicated arguments into the field in a debate. Your ability to sustain a sentence and to have it communicable, have it like actually mean something to your adjudicator, is a direct function of you eliminating the sort of verbal tics that are very common in debaters, saying like or saying right, saying Mr. Speaker every 3 or 4 words. This is extremely common, right? Speaking extremely fast and with like essentially monotone does not enable you to convey complicated thoughts, because your ability to vary your tone is something that helps your adjudicator understand differing levels of abstraction within your sentence and understand the structure of that sentence so that they gain meaning out of it. Those are extremely important for having arguments that actually like mean something to your adjudicator, that communicates something, and it is a skill that is very often neglected. It is one that you can't afford to neglect if you want to progress as debaters. It involves a lot of troubling times in front of mirrors or recording yourself talking and forcing yourself to change those habits. It is very confrontational to do that, but it is necessary for being able to improve as a debater. Before I go on to an intermediate level, does anybody have questions? Deepak?
Whenever I try and be emotional in debates, I feel like it comes across as disingenuous, just because, like, why does this guy give a shit so strongly about this particular topic? Is that something that comes across from an adjudicator's perspective?
It very often does, and this involves a lot of experimentation on your part. Look at experienced debaters in recordings. Find something that works for you. Try and imitate certain things. Often what happens is that you're using too much emotion in some cases, and that's extremely harmful. What you want to be doing is finding the right balance depending on the topic that you are talking about, the scale of the harms you're talking about, and how you talk about and integrate those things. So, intermediate level. First thing that I want you to think about. Oh, yeah, Mary? Oh, I'm sorry, but please go ahead.
Another just answer to Deepak, which is probably a bit more facetious than Golka's answer, is just don't be disingenuous. Make yourself believe that side of the topic. I think you can like play little mind games on yourself where you just genuinely listen to what the other side says and go, oh my god, that will never work. And then say that in the debate. You will often sound not disingenuous if you know us.
Yeah. I'd also point out that if you find yourself unable to care about the stakeholder that you're advocating for, you probably need to find a better stakeholder, right? One last question?
Yeah, I just want to know, like, what are the effects of, like, I always notice that sometimes the way you phrase sentences will also matter. So what is like a drill or a particular exercise that you can do to actually improve the way how we phrase things and frame things persuasively?
So I think there are two things that you can do. First thing is find experienced debaters' speeches, so World's Grand Finals level or Austral's Grand Finals level. Type out a part of that speech, an introduction is often very useful for this, and say it out loud. Repeat it until you get a feeling for the sentence, a feeling for the flow of that sentence and how they're talking. The second thing I'd point out is that a sentence is a subject, a verb, and an object. Forcing yourself to recognize that, forcing yourself to speak with full stops is extremely important for being able to improve your manner, especially with regards to the skill that you mentioned. And often what happens is debaters will start speaking in an enormous paragraph that lasts their entire speech, that has lots of commas, a couple of semicolons, and very, very few full stops. Having full stops is important, okay? Cool. Like, practice normal English grammar in the way you speak. So, you had one last question?
Yes. Just earlier in your example with the prisons one, you said that if you were making, one argument, oh, it's humane, but also, we want to punish them, and there'd be an obvious disconnect, and there is. But how then do you play a strategy of trying to say this argument is good regardless of the direction you wish to be taking it? Does that sort of make sense?
Not really.
Okay.
Which aspect of the argument are you challenging?
No, I'm challenging. I'm asking you.
No, I mean, if you are seeing this government case that says, we want rehabilitation outcome, we think that this is the way to get rehabilitation journey, which part of that do you want to challenge?
What if you want to challenge both?
How would you do that?
Well, that's my question.
If the things that you are saying are logically discordant with each other, you should not say both of them. Instead, you should try and win on one of those things.
Even if both of them are pretty good.
But they're not good together, right?
That's what I'm saying.
Your adjudicator will not believe you as a speaker if you are arguing and trying to argue passionately and persuasively for things that cannot logically exist at the same time. Because you as an adjudicator, you want to trust somebody. You want to trust that they know what's going on. If that person is arguing for two contradictory things simultaneously, evidently they don't know what's going on. They have no opinion, right? And that's an important part of having a coherent debate case, is having a coherent mind about what you think about the world.
So you would argue against going like, well, we believe that the destination is punishment, but even if the destination was rehabilitation, we still disagree on that.
I think that's possible so long as you aren't arguing that it is more punishment in the way that they are presenting their case. But if you can find a way to do these things at the same time, by all means do that. But once again, be clear to your adjudicator which you are contesting at which moment in your speech. Don't conflate them, don't integrate them, because that's how your adjudicator is going to hate the world, right? Make sure it is clear at each point in your case which aspect of this you are contesting. So, intermediate level. First thing to point out here. If you are a closing team and your opening team does not do any impacting and just does not seem to care about the issues or does not give you any reason to care about these issues, it can often be extremely useful and persuasive to just gobble up that ground in your introduction. So there's a debate online, which I'm not going to find, but it was essentially that for climate change policy, it should be administered by technocrats rather than by democracies. The opening half had not impacted climate change. What that means is that Chris Bissett gets to stand up at government member and say something to the effect of, ladies and gentlemen, climate change is a reality. It is going to uproot the very foundations of how we live. It is going to displace the most heavily capitalized industries on Earth. And the idea that some pork barreling in some districts means this is a time for democracy and compromise is truly bizarre, right? And that little bit of impacting, that little bit of saying, actually this thing we are talking about is important, is extremely effective in taking a huge amount of ground in the debate. So, second thing to talk about in this debate, which is in intermediate, more about manner. In terms of manner, the next stage after you have cleaned up your speaking process is to talk about individual people doing, thinking, and saying actual things. Very often, people run arguments only as abstract, and what that means is that a lot of the persuasive power of that debate is lost. I'm going to give you an example from Monish's very own Madeline Schultz. So, this is not helpful. Here we are. Right. So the topic is that the government should fund media and pop culture that portrays mental illness as a normal and acceptable condition. Madeline Schultz is opposing, and she is opposing here.
In society do not understand the challenges that someone going through that illness looks like. But let's look at the conclusions that they're trying to get people to draw from seeing those characters. The way Keith portrays it, they want people to see those characters, recognise those symptoms in themselves or in their loved ones, and therefore seek treatment. But that ignores the quite nuanced way in which those portrayals send messages. Seeing someone who has mental illness doesn't automatically make you feel comfortable seeking treatment. If the way that mental illness is portrayed is as something that lasts over season after season regardless of treatment, why would you think that treatment was likely to work? And guess what? You've just financially incentivized that exact portrayal of mental illness. If you see someone who's interacting normally in their day-to-day life with their work or with other characters or maintaining social friendships because the producers need that in order to actually show that character in any scenes, how do you feel when you then can't do that yourself but you feel that same depression? How accurate do you feel that is about you? How likely do you feel that you're going to be able to seek treatment or respond? How alienated do you feel by a society that sees that as the most normal perception of what mental illness looks like? Which brings me to my second.
Madeline is excellent. And what she does there is she brings the topic to a very, very visceral human level. She is talking about very, very individual personal experiences of what someone who sees and interacts with this media might undergo. And because she does that, she makes those people and their suffering and what they experience feel extraordinarily important in the debate. You cannot afford to ignore that argument. And it didn't involve describing huge numbers of people. It didn't involve saying that this stakeholder was the biggest stakeholder in the debate or it affected millions of Australians. It just involved her saying, this is what it is like to experience this. And that can be something extremely powerful. Obviously, as a disclaimer, don't describe visceral traumatic experiences if you don't have to, right? This is extremely important and can land you in hot water if you're not careful. But having manner that can describe things on a very individual level is still extremely important for impacting a lot of otherwise abstract arguments. Think how less impactful that argument would have been if she'd have just said, people with mental illness will sometimes feel alienated by this media, right? So, next thing I want to talk about is how to impact principled arguments, which brings us to my second example. So, the topic is that the world's poor would be justified in pursuing complete Marxist revolution. Right? Yep. All right. So this is Beau's first substantive argument, and it's...
No, but it's such a good
I don't care. Intros is a different session. All right. This specifically, I want you to look at how he goes through a principled argument and how he makes it important to the debate.
Two things, then, I'm going to begin this speech with. First, private property constitutes a fundamental assault in human dignity in three key respects. First, it is found and it has been acquired unjustly. In the vast majority of instances, the reason why wealthy countries are wealthy is through processes like colonialism, through slavery, through patriarchy. It represents plunder when you refuse to give any representation or resources to from whom you took money. But even if it wasn't, in those direct instances of theft, in many instances it was negligence. That's to say the creation of vastly constrictive intellectual property rates that means that individuals don't, in the poor, have proper access to things like medication. It's refusal to tax properly. We think negligence is just as morally culpable. The fact that it is unjustly acquired in and of itself gives the poor a claim to that property and to an institution that is itself been harmful. The second thing it enables the poor in terms of a principle is that it allows them to get redress in opposition to centuries of disenfranchisement. That is to say, theft and negligence represent the stripping of the individual right to assert themselves. We're going to give you systematic reasons why you don't get reforms on their side, but notice that this as a principled argument is independent from a consideration of practices. That's to say, compensation or giving more money is unlike categorically what these people require in principle, which is a redress from the fact that they've been taken out of the system of moral equality by theft and negligence. The last thing to say is let's take them at their best. That is, let's...
All right, so what do you notice he is doing structurally there that you could import into virtually any other principled argument? Interesting.
I think the fact is that after establishing each key premise, he then spends some time to explain as to why that premise is important and relevant to the stakeholder that he's talking about. So, in a sense, where he says that A, they have a moral claim to the particular system, particular property, or something along the lines of like, we also need the only way to actually adequately compensate that is through this following method and not the following methods that the opposition is going for. I think that relevant link is the ones that is like powering his argument forward.
Any other thoughts?
Did it even if, and let's take them at their best.
Yes, those are very important. What else?
He described, like, in his justification, he described the individual actions that resulted in this being justified very, very, like, in a lot of detail and very clearly.
Anything else? Yep.
He used full stops.
He did, in fact, use full stops. He used clear sentences. He took very, very abstract Marxist principle and brought it at least to the level of this means you don't get access to a medication, right? Something very, very tangible that people can relate to, which is hard to do when you have 7 minutes to justify a Marxist revolution, right? But I think there are a couple of things that are structurally important, and I think it's a quarterfinal where he does another opening government speech about giving special economic zones specifically to women, he does the exact same structure on what is virtually exact same point, right? And some of the same beats that he argues are things like this principle is independent of a consideration of practice, right? The second thing that I think is important is that he ties very, very specifically the type of redress he wants to the topic. And what that means is that people can't get away by saying there are other ways to get the same sort of redress. And I think, once again, you said having the even-if argument at the end is also quite important. But I want us to try and put those same arguments into our argument about our friend Jamal and his decision to join a gang rather than pursue legitimate employment. So the place this argument was at was We think that racism is something that attacks people's core identity. It's something that attacks people's sense of belonging, their ability to become a part of our society, that is a society that has now rejected them. Therefore, we think that Jamal is justified in joining something that gives them that very specific sense of belonging, sense of identity, and sense of brotherhood. How do we put in these same forms of impacting on this principal point to this particular argument? Anyone have any thoughts?
Go through these specific instances in which society has hurt Jamal and go to I don't know, access to work or something, and then go through each of those and describe that scenario.
Yeah. So that's things like saying what experiencing racism means is that when you try and gain friends at your workplace, they reject you. It's things like saying you are too frightened to go to the same police that are often discriminatory to you. You are too frightened to go to to hospitals, right? Which means that you have to find other ways to get that sort of redress. Critically, what is important here, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, is that Jamal doesn't want money. Jamal doesn't want safety. Jamal wants a community that accepts him. Jamal wants a place where he can go and have an identity, one that he isn't rejected from on the basis of his skin color. Jamal wants someone who tells him that he can take pride in who he is. And we think that gang culture, as a culture that is outside of the legitimate identities of the state, when those legitimate identities say that his identity isn't legitimate, is the only way that he can find those things, right? Tied very, very specifically to those sorts of considerations that the topic asks of you, right? So having that direct attack on his identity and being left out from legal forms of belonging means illegal forms of belonging are things that are vitally important to him. Is that a question?
If you're on the other side of either of those arguments, it's almost an axiomatically different argument that someone's putting forward. That's sort of as with the Marxist debate, the restitution isn't actually the restitution that they deserve. Which, how do you rebut an argument that is essentially saying there is no argument you can provide other than this one that is going to satisfy?
With some difficulty, because that's a well-constructed argument, right? But there are certainly ways that you can do that. For example, you can say that, describe ways in which gang culture further alienates you from identity, ways in which gang culture tries to manipulate you or tries to use you for its own ends, ways in which gang culture will drop someone if they don't accept the norms of that gang, right? There are a whole bunch of ways in which gang culture is not the best way to find belonging, right? So you can challenge those things. But part of that is knowing that what you're doing there is accepting that belonging is the outcome that Jamal wants, right? So you're contesting the journey in that case. Does anybody think there's a way that you can contest the destination in this case? Yeah.
I think that the sense of there's a false premise that he posits, right? Where you actually say that, only the state can only the state won't recognize identity. I think that the recognition of identity forms within communities themselves, right? Communities that happen under the purview of states. That's why refugees have their own communities, even without the involvement of gang members, etc. So it is up to these communities to recognize a sense of self and sense of worth that you can actually achieve even without joining the gangs in itself.
Yep.
So the fact that you join a gang actually puts yourself in opposition to a safe form of community and a safe form of recognition of identity that you have. Which is counterintuitive to what you're trying to fight for.
Yep, definitely. Another way to combat this was the way that I tried to do this in the debate I was in, which was to say, we think that joining that gang, that dealing drugs, you will almost certainly be dealing those drugs to other people of color. You will almost certainly be inviting violence into that same community. What you are doing is becoming a part of the attack on that community. You are becoming a part of the systematic destruction of that identity and the violence that's associated with this, right? But what you can see, what we're doing there, is because we have had a well-constructed principled argument to contend with, you have to think quite hard to find ways to get around that argument. Actually, you were first.
Can you also just like straight up disagree and say like do a different or better characterization of Jamal and say like, no, Jamal's priority isn't community, it's not getting shot and having food on the table, and like say no, this argument isn't important because we think Jamal's more likely to care about these things.
Absolutely, and you're contesting the destination there. You're saying this value is not a thing that we think is an important value or an important enough value to warrant this action in the debate. And recognizing that you're doing that and making a systematic attack on that is something that's very important for making sure that that's done well. So, let's move on now to practical types of debate. How long do I have, by the way? Oh, cool.
Like, you got 5 minutes.
Holy Jesus. You'll all stay late. So, practical. The most important thing when it comes to practical debates, practical arguments and making sure that they are well impacted is asking yourself what part of this argument will be most contested in this debate. When you select your examples that you want to use examples that attack or defend the contested part of that debate specifically. I'm going to show you a little bit later in Beau's speech how he does that. At 7 minutes 19.
Leads to good outcomes. Notice what, on the other side, the reason why they need to defend the status quo is that they don't get the levers of structural reforms that you require. There are 3 reasons for this. The first is the democratic system, that through processes of gerrymandering which are almost irrevocable in very many parts of the world, the poor are systematically disenfranchised. They don't control hegemonic media that control media narratives about what good policy is. They're usually kept apart by racist rhetoric that accentuates other ascriptive descriptions, preventing them from coming forward. The fact of historical disenfranchisement, furthermore, means that they're less likely to turn out the vote in a way that other people are.
All right. So what he's arguing is that the poor do not have other mechanisms by which they can change the status quo and improve the situation for themselves. He does not go after this by saying Republicans are in government at the moment, or that we're seeing an increasing trend of that throughout the world. What he picks is very systematic, structural levers of power in our society, right? Whether or not the other side says there are legitimate democratic means to express your vote as a poor person, he's already covered that because he said that gerrymandering has removed the ability of the poor to have legitimate access to the vote. Whether or not the other side says something like the poor can have media representation, they can organize themselves that way, they can fight back against that gerrymandering, he's already explained that the media is controlled by hegemonic, powerful forces who control capital in our society, right? By picking very specific structural examples, he's made sure that that argument isn't something that can be lightly brushed aside, and it's something that probably the other side is going to have to find 2 or 3 attacks down the bench in order to be able to defeat. What that means is his argument is relevant at closing. His argument still has to be dealt with by closing. And what that means is that he obviously has a great deal of impact on the course of the debate, what needs to be attacked or defended within that debate, and that means that he's going to, win. So what this means in more broad terms, when we talk about first principles spectrums in terms of how we conceive particular viewpoints in the debate, you want to find examples that most closely cleave to your position or your opponent's position in order to combat or defend particular positions. So, a very common thing that I see is somebody is arguing that we shouldn't have restrictive hate speech laws because freedom of speech is important, and the other side gets up and says, well, by that logic, I should be able to punch people in the faces because if I have a right to freedom, then surely I have a right to punch someone, right? But that's obviously not what the other side is arguing for. It's an example of a radical freedom, sure, but it's probably not one that's very close to the position that the other side is arguing for. And instead what you want to say is, sure, but you're probably not going to have something like libel laws. Libel laws are an attack on a person because it harms them in a way that isn't directly physical and does so on the basis of falsity. We think that hate speech is directly analogous because hate speech attacks someone in a way that isn't directly physical, but nevertheless is extraordinarily harmful to them. And we think that hate speech is something that is based on falsity, is based on unreality, and we think that equally it applies there. Notice what I've done here is I've picked an example that is very, very close to the thing that the other side is arguing, and I've teased out the very specific parts of that example that I feel are analogous. That forces the other side to deal with it. It means that the other side can't get away with simple rhetoric by just saying that's clearly an absurd mischaracterization of what we're saying. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this session is stakeholders. Why is a group of people important? This is going to be rapid fire, just very easy stuff about how you can make a stakeholder group impactful in a debate. This is probably what you thought my entire session would be about. Joke's on you. So, number one, what is the scale of that group? Is it a large group? Is it a small group? If it is large, say that it's large. Say that it outweighs the group that the other side is advocating for. Secondly, what is the vulnerability of that group? Are they people who have been systematically disenfranchised by the system? Are they people who are regularly the subject of violence? Do those people not have access to other means of expressing themselves or defending themselves from attack? Thirdly, scale of harm on that group. Sure, this policy might make some, the rest of Australia, have to think about their speech a little bit more, and that's really, really terrible for them. But what we're talking about and what we're trying to defend is those few people who are beaten half to death because of the rhetoric that's espoused by hate speech. We are happy for the rest of Australia to have to watch their mouth at dinner time if it means we protect those people. Fourthly, structural importance of that group. Sure, the rest of Australia might not have, might not be the greatest interest in having to defend themselves at dinner time, but it is the rest of Australia that is voting on the policies that affect the lives of those people. It is the rest of Australia that constructs the media landscape and the policy landscape that minorities will have to live in, and we think pissing them off in a way that means that they construct those laws in a way that is more vindictive, more harmful, is ultimately going to be worse for those people than the way that they would undertake otherwise. Fifthly, you can talk about the temporal relationship of a group or a harm. So, this is, for example, saying something like, we think that this group of people, because they exist now, because they are being hurt now, are the group that should be the primary consideration in this debate. We think that a harm that is in front of us is more important to think about and to talk about and to try to prevent. Because ultimately, there are many, many things that may prevent harms going into the future. But when there is a real crime happening in front of you, a humanitarian crisis, it behooves you to act right now to save those people, and you have a duty to do that. Or, on the other side, you can say something like, we think that when you go through this policy of saving those few people, knowing that down the track it's going to create policy that's going to hurt more in the long run, it is illegitimate to prioritize the safety of people in the current state against those who exist in the future. Those people also have rights, those people also deserve to be defended, and we're happy to stand for them in this debate. So, those are a bunch of ways in which you can talk about stakeholders to try and make those stakeholders seem impactful. The last thing I was going to talk about is how to do this in an advanced context, but I believe Pizza is here? Yes?
Should be on its way.
Should be.
Keep talking.
So real quick.
Okay, how to do this in an advanced context. What you will notice for extremely advanced debates, and I'm talking about world semi-finals and grand finals type of debates, is that people's speeches gain meaning in the terms that they use over time. And this is something that occurs across a whole team. Often a mistake I see a lot of novice and intermediate debaters make is that they feel they have to defend every premise at every point of their debate. And this is why they start speaking in paragraphs, because they realize that a part of their speech relies on another part of their speech that they've tried to defend, but they're not sure if they won it, and so they have to remind the adjudicator of the analysis they did there, and so the whole thing starts to collapse into this sort of meringue of structureless nonsense, okay? Good debaters understand what they are winning on. Good debaters understand that when they say a term in the debate, they infuse that term with meaning by describing its effects on that debate, right? And what that means is that they and their teammates, more crucially, get to refer to those harms in a very shorthand way. And what this can be is extremely frustrating to debaters who aren't sort of used to that, because it sounds like just an assertion of something you've contested and you don't realize that they've defended it. That skill is something that is extremely hard to develop, and it's hard to know when it is you're winning something. The way that you do that is by doing lots of debates, doing lots of adjudication, but it's also by trusting that your partner and that you in other parts of your speech did the significant enough impacting of your points that they stuck in the debate. That when you made that complete defense of a particular idea, the adjudicator has understood that idea, and that because you titled that idea, because the adjudicator knows that title of that idea, you have infused that phrase with a particular specific meaning in that debate, and you can refer back to that in other parts of your speech, and particularly in conclusions. Those are all ways that advanced debaters can utilize the impacting that they have done in order to advance themselves in the debate and speak better. So, those are my thoughts on impacting. Does anybody have any questions?
When you say infuse meanings into certain phrases, can you actually tell us an example of how would you do that?
I would, but I ran out of time when I was prepping. So, if you are in a development debate, right, and you spend a great deal of time defending the idea of what you think development ought to look like, and you've decided the type of development you want to advocate for is a very rapid development. It's a development that as soon as possible injects wealth into a country, that it does this with an enormous use of foreign direct investment and foreign capital, that it attempts to use government policy to entice that, even at the cost of rights in the short term, because you think that is most important. And what that means is you get access to technology. You get companies that build roads. You get access to earth-moving equipment. You get access to mines. You get access to intellectual property. You forge deals with those companies. It creates employment. It creates the structures of a middle class. It slowly begins to upskill your people and mean you start to lift yourself out of poverty. That is the crucial part of this debate, and that's what we support. Your partner then gets to stand up and say, what we brought you was an idea of rapid development. The other side is concerned in this debate about human rights. The other side is concerned about people's access to equality. The other side is concerned about the ability of children to access education. What we told you is that the most rapid form of development is the one that provides those things soonest, because it provides those benefits quickest. And that's what we stood for in this debate. Because you have infused the term rapid development with a particular meaning that your adjudicator understands, because it was a concentrated part of your speech, you get to refer to that. Even if that rapid development and its mechanisms were contested, your adjudicator knows and understands what you mean by that, and they can probably trust that you will get to that in its due course in your speech. And that gives you a bit more freedom in your structure. Having good manner is the first step to doing this, you will notice. Having manner where the adjudicator can take note of the specific phrasing that you are using, because your manner is clear, because you are speaking in full sentences, is something that's extremely important in being able to convey this. Any more questions? Yep.
So this is a question that was a while back, but sort of a thing that I noticed, and I'm sorry, a bit of a personally relevant one, because other people don't seem to have this problem. But the note of personalizing an argument and bringing it down to sort of like a level like you showed the video, I think it was Madeline, wasn't it? Doing. I personally find those arguments less convincing, so they don't come to my head as something to do a lot. Apparently lots of other people find them very convincing, whereas I find them almost intellectually dishonest because they don't deal with the big issue, they deal with a person. It's sort of like a heels over reels type thing. And so how do you know which ones are good and bad if it's not those?
Basically, every abstract argument should have its very concrete counterpart. An example of this is from an Australs debate I was in, and we were opposing the idea that vegetarians should aggressively proselytize. Okay? One of the reasons why we didn't win that debate, aside from being against a very good team, was because our analysis, up until third, was people will be ostracized by their friends by doing this. Our analysis was it will make it uncomfortable to talk to your friends from doing this, right? But at third, and this was just too late to impact the debate, unfortunately, we turn that argument into who invites a vegetarian to dinner if they know that that vegetarian will confront them day in, day out with their immorality? Who would want to be friends with that person? Who invites them to group chats? Who shares memes with them? Right? What is going on? And that's my note. But it's the same argument, it's the same abstract argument, and it's the same intellectually valid argument, but it's one that your adjudicator can actually see playing out at dinner tables, playing out in people's conversations, playing out in friendships. It's the slow distancing of yourself from that person because they bug you. It's thinking, well, I know this person who really likes steak. Which of these people do I now decide to invite round? I can only have one. And that means that slowly the vegetarian community gets less and less chances to interact with the rest of the human race, and less chances to actually convince somebody or change minds. Okay? So it's the same thing, it's just done in a way that is much more convincing, if you see what I mean.
So, I don't know. I'm a bit strong, that's where we sort of get to, isn't it? But it's like, so one of the things that came up before, I think it was the fast fashion, I think 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
One of the things that came up was like an economic analysis type thing, right?
Yeah.
And I was told to personalize that as a
Yeah, that was me.
yeah.
What was your economic analysis?
Well, essentially, like, free trade is good, examples, capitalism 101. That was, but to personalize that down almost feels to miss the point of the argument, because you can have successful people in any society. Saying something feels good or feels bad for someone can happen in almost any situation. What matters is the sort of larger structural, how many actual people is this relevant to, and so personalizing that is.
It's not just how many people is this relevant to, it's how relevant is it to those people? To what extent are they benefited by the policy? In order for your adjudicator to believe that someone is significantly benefited by something, and one comparatively has a better quality of life than if they lived their life in a different way under a different economic regime, then being able to imagine that person, imagine their happiness at being finally able to have a job, their happiness at having even a meager wage, which means that they can provide for their children they otherwise might not be able to, their joy that they have at least some access to medicines because they have a company who has an interest in their health being present in that country. Those are all ways that you can very much personalize this. And I'll give you one final example of this. So I was in an Easter's debate, and the topic was price gouging. So like Uber-based price gouging, right? And a novice said that something to the effect of lack of services in extreme weather means people's available choice decreases, which lowers the general utility. He was talking about people starving to death in hurricanes. Which of those two phrasings is more persuasive? I leave that to you to try and work out, right? Anyway, pizza is here. You've all been great.